Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling a question that is so fundamental. I mean, it's so woven to the fabric of just being a person that it really determines who and what you are.
It really does. And it's funny, it's probably the single biggest dividing line in all of philosophy, going way back. But it's also, right now, the biggest roadblock in modern science and tech.
We're talking about the mind and the body.
Exactly. The nature of reality itself, which seems to come into, well, very different seeming pieces.
Right, because everyone listening, you live in these two realms constantly, every second of the day. You've got your inner world, this, invisible flow of thoughts, feelings, memories, that little light of consciousness that is you.
And then you have the outer world, your body, your brain, the physical matter that you are, which is, governed by these very strict objective laws of physics and chemistry.
And that tension is really the core of our deep dive today. So when you make a choice, let's say, to just stand up from your chair right now, was that decision made by something non-physical?
Like a soul or a spirit, sort of reaching into the physical world and making something happen.
Or is that feeling of making a choice just an illusion? Is it really just an incredibly complex cascade of electrochemical signals firing in your brain that were, determined from the moment before?
That is the big question. Our sources today give us a great set of arguments for, well, for both sides of that divide, and they make it really clear why this ancient philosophical fight matters so much for us today.
Yeah. We're going to see how your answer to that question really changes how you think about everything. Consciousness, free will, the possibility of an afterlife.
And even really pressing modern issues like how we should build artificial intelligence or how we should approach treating mental health.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start with what we actually mean by mind and body, because if we don't nail down the terms, the whole thing just gets, fuzzy.
We absolutely need that precision. So when philosophers talk about the body, they're talking about the physical, observable part of a person. It's the matter you're made of.
So it takes up space, it has mass, it follows the laws of gravity.
Exactly. It's what's called extended in space. It includes your brain, your nervous system, all the organs, all the chemistry. It's the public, objective thing.
This stuff a scientist can actually measure. You and I can both look at a brain scan and, agree on what we're seeing.
Precisely. Now, the mind, that's a whole different beast. Here we shift completely into the subjective realm.
The first-person experience.
Yes. The mind is all of that.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, your feelings, sensations, memories, your imagination, your desires.
And this is where that crucial term consciousness comes in. It's not just the processing of information, it's the what it feels like part.
The what it is likeness. What it feels like to see the color red, or to taste coffee, or to feel that specific pang of sadness when you remember something. That private internal experience is the mind for our purposes.
Okay, so you've got the objective, measurable brain tissue on one hand, and the subjective, private experience on the other.
And right there, that's the problem. The mind-body problem is just asking, how are those two related? Is the mind something non-physical that's separate from the brain? Or is it 100% produced by the brain and nothing more?
To get into that, I think we have to start with the answer that has dominated human history, mostly because it just feels so intuitive. We have to start with dualism.
Right. Dualism is simply the position that mind and body are distinct. They're not the same kind of reality at all. They might interact, but they're made of different fundamental stuff.
And the classic version, the one that I think most people would come up with on their own, is called substance dualism.
Yes, this is the one that was really crystallized by René Descartes. He argued that there are two completely different kinds of substances in the universe.
Okay, so what are the two?
The first is physical substance. That's the body, the brain, all the stuff we just talked about. Its defining feature is that it's extended in space. It takes up room.
And the second one is?
Mental substance. This is often what people call the soul or the spirit. And its defining feature is thought or consciousness. It is not in space. It's non-physical. It doesn't take up any room.
So the implication there is huge.
Right.
It means that your essential self, are that mental thing, that soul, and you're just sort of piloting a physical machine.
That's the idea. You're temporarily housed in a body. And because the mind, the soul, is non-physical, it doesn't necessarily need the body to exist. It opens the door, logically, to the idea that the soul could survive the death of the body.
It's easy to see why that's so popular, but what are the actual philosophical arguments for it? I mean, beyond just intuition, what are the strong defenses?
Well, the sources lay out three main ones. The first is what we can call the inner versus outer knowledge argument.
Okay.
As we said, you have this immediate, direct, privileged access to your own thought. You don't infer your thoughts, you just have them. You know them from the inside.
Right. I know I'm feeling anxious right now directly. But if I wanted to know what my brain was doing, I'd need an MRI machine. I only know my brain from the outside, like any other object.
And the dual says, look, if the way you know these two things is so fundamentally different, one by direct experience, the other by external observation, that's a really strong clue that the things themselves are fundamentally different.
That makes sense. What's the second argument?
The second is the conceivability argument. This is Descartes' famous move. He said, basically, I can coherently imagine myself existing as a purely thinking thing without anybody at all.
Like a ghost or a spirit.
Exactly. And his logic was, if I can clearly and distinctly conceive of my mind existing separately from my body, then it must be possible for them to exist separately. Therefore, they must be two different things.
But wait a second. I mean, just because I can imagine something, does that make it real? I can imagine flying by, flapping my arms, but physics says no.
And that is precisely the physicalist counter-argument, and it's a very strong one. They'd say that what you're imagining is just a failure of your own imagination. You don't fully grasp how deeply your mind is tied to your brain.
So you can imagine it, but it's not actually possible in reality.
Right. The physicalist says you're conceiving it doesn't prove anything about reality. But for the dualist, that intuitive ability to separate them in your mind is a powerful starting point.
Okay, so let's get to the third one, which I think is probably the most powerful and the most discussed today. The argument from qualia.
Yes, qualia. This is the central weapon in the modern dualist's arsenal. Qualia are the subjective, felt qualities of experience.
The what it's likeness.
Exactly. The redness of red, the sweetness of sugar, the specific feeling of pain. We can give a complete physical description of what's happening when you see a sunset, the wavelengths of light, the neurons firing in your visual cortex.
But none of that scientific data, no matter how detailed, seems to ever capture the actual feeling of seeing that beautiful orange color, or the feeling of awe.
The physical description is rich, but it leaves out the most important part, the experience itself. And the classic thought experiment, to highlight this, is Mary's room.
Right, I love this one. So lay out the scenario for us.
Okay, so imagine a neuroscientist named Mary. She is without question the world's leading expert on the science of color vision.
She knows everything.
Everything, every physical fact. She knows exactly what happens in the brain when someone sees a red rose, the wavelengths, the chemistry, the firing patterns. But there's a catch.
She's lived her entire life in a black and white room.
She has never, ever seen color herself. She's only learned about it from black and white books and monitors.
Okay, so she knows all the physical facts, but has zero color experience.
Right. Now, the crucial question is this. One day, the door opens. Mary walks out of the room and sees a red rose for the very first time. Does she learn anything new?
And the dualist answer is, of course she does.
Unquestionably, yes. She learns what it's like to see red. She acquires a new piece of knowledge, the quale of red.
So if she already knew all the physical fact before she left the room, but she learned something new when she had the experience.
Then that new thing she learned, the experience, the qualia, must be a non-physical fact. And if there are non-physical facts about the world, then physicalism must be false. Consciousness has to be more than just the physical brain.
That is a really compelling argument and feels like it gets to the heart of the mystery. But, okay, now we have to turn to the other side. What are the massive problems that have led so many people to just completely reject this kind of dualism?
There are huge challenges. And the most famous one, the one that has plagued this view for centuries, is the interaction problem.
Okay, what is that?
It's simple, but it's devastating. If the mind is non-physical, if it has no location, no mass, no energy, no physical properties at all, and the body is purely physical, how in the world do they interact?
How does a non-physical thought, my desire to pick up this mug, actually cause physical neurons in my brain to fire and make my physical arm move?
And the other way around, too. How does a purely physical event, like stubbing your toe, cause a non-physical experience of pain? In physics, causation requires some sort of contact, some energy transfer.
Right. Something has to push something.
Yes. If the mind is totally outside of physics, how does it do the pushing? Physicalists argue that for a non-physical mind to affect the brain, you would have to magically introduce new energy or information into the closed physical system of the universe.
Which would violate fundamental laws of physics, like the conservation of energy.
Exactly. It would mean that energy just appeared out of nowhere in your brain from outside the physical cosmos. And for a scientist, it's basically an insurmountable barrier.
And beyond that, there's just the overwhelming evidence of how much the mind seems to depend on the brain.
The dependence on the brain argument is crushing for substance dualism. If the soul were truly a separate, non-physical thing just using the brain, you'd think it would be pretty resilient to physical damage.
But that's not what we see at all. A brain injury, a disease like Alzheimer's, even just taking certain drugs or drinking too much alcohol, it can completely change your personality, your memories, your consciousness.
The mental substance seems terrifyingly fragile and dependent on the physical state of the brain. If the mind is just the pilot, why does damaging the plane's radio fundamentally change the pilot's personality?
Yeah, that doesn't add up. So these problems were so big, they forced a lot of dualists to sort of retreat to a weaker position.
A compromise, yes.
Mhm.
This brings us to property dualism. They see the fatal flaws in substance dualism, but they still want to save the reality of qualia, of Mary's experience.
So what's the shift? How do they do that?
They accept that there is only one kind of substance in the universe: physical matter. The brain is a physical object, no soul.
Okay, so that's a big concession to the physicalists.
It is. But, they argue, this physical substance can have two radically different kinds of properties. It has normal physical properties like mass and electrical charge, and it also has special non-reducible mental properties.
Like consciousness, the experience of red.
Exactly. So the mind isn't a separate thing. It's a special set of properties that emerges from the brain when it reaches a certain level of complexity.
Ah, so it's an emergent view. Like wetness is an emergent property of HO molecules. You can't say a single molecule is wet, but when you get enough of them together in the right way, wetness emerges.
That's a classic analogy. And the key for the property dualist is that once this mental property of consciousness emerges, it can't be fully explained or broken down into the language of physics. It's a real fundamental feature of the world that arises from the physical, but isn't just the physical.
So it tries to save Mary's special knowledge without having to believe in a ghost in the machine.
That's the goal. It's a way of taking consciousness seriously without violating the laws of physics.
Okay, we've laid out the dualist camp, but I mean, the sheer success of science over the last few hundred years has really pushed most philosophers and scientists into the opposite camp. Physicalism.
Absolutely. Physicalism, sometimes called materialism,
Ah.
is very straightforward at its core. It says everything that exists is ultimately physical, and that includes your mind.
No exceptions.
No exceptions. Mental states are simply processes or states of the physical brain. There's no soul, no non-physical properties, nothing extra.
And the reasons this view is so powerful are pretty obvious, right?
I think so. The biggest driver is just plain scientific success. Every single time we study the mind, whether it's memory or emotion or decision-making, what do we find?
We find brain activity, we find chemical processes.
We find perfectly correlated neurobiological activity. The evidence is just a mountain, and it's all pointing in one direction. There has never been a single, reliably observed mental event that happened without a corresponding brain event.
And as we talked about before, there's the appeal of simplicity and causal closure. Physicalism gives you one kind of stuff in your universe, not two.
It's Occam's razor. The simplest explanation that fits the facts is probably the best. And it keeps the world of physics neat and tidy. The physical universe is a closed system. Physical events have physical causes. No need for mysterious, spooky forces coming in from the outside.
Okay, so if we accept physicalism, if we say the mind is physical,
Yeah.
how does that work exactly? There are different flavors of this, right?
Yes, physicalists have different theories about the precise relationship. The most direct and maybe simplest version is the identity theory.
And the name says it all, I guess.
It does. The core claim is that a specific mental state, like the feeling of pain you're having right now, is literally identical to a specific brain state. The firing of your C fibers, for instance.
So it's not that the brain state causes the pain, it's that the brain state is the pain. They are the exact same thing, just described with two different sets of words.
Exactly. The analogy is water is HEO, or lightning is an electrical discharge. Pain is our folk psychology term. C fiber activation is the scientific term. They refer to the very same event in the world.
So a future neuroscientist could, in theory, look at a scan of your brain and say, ah, he's thinking about his grandmother, because that thought is that specific pattern of neural firing.
That's the promise of the theory. But it ran into a big problem, which is called multiple realizability.
Right. What does that mean?
Well, think about a mental state like pain. Humans can feel pain, but so can dogs and octopuses and probably, some alien species we might meet one day.
And we all have very, very different brains. An octopus brain is nothing like a human brain.
Exactly. So if pain in a human is C fiber firing, what is it in an octopus which doesn't have C fibers? If they can both feel pain, then pain cannot be identical to any one specific physical state. The same mental state can be realized in multiple different physical systems.
And that problem led to the next and probably the dominant version of physicalism today, functionalism.
Correct. Functionalism was a huge breakthrough because it shifted the focus away from the material hardware of the mind and onto its operational role, its software.
So it's not about what the mind is made of, but what it does.
Precisely. A mental state is defined by its causal role in a system. What causes it and what does it cause?
Okay, give me an example.
Let's take pain again. Functionally, pain is a state that is typically caused by bodily damage. It then causes other mental states like belief, I am hurt, and desire, I want this to stop. And it causes certain behaviors like wincing, crying out, or pulling your hand away.
So anything that plays that exact same functional role in a system counts as being in pain, regardless of whether it's made of neurons or silicon chips or green alien slime.
That's the radical implication. And it's why functionalism is the philosophical bedrock of a lot of work in artificial intelligence. It says that if you can build a machine that perfectly replicates the functional pattern of human inputs, internal processing, and outputs, then you have, by definition, created a mind.
So it gets rid of what you could call biological chauvinism, the idea that only carbon-based life can be conscious.
Right. A sufficiently complex computer could have a genuine mind, according to functionalism.
This sounds like a really elegant solution. It solves multiple realizability, it fits with AI research, but I know there's a famous thought experiment designed specifically to attack this view.
There is. The Chinese room argument from the philosopher John Searle. And it's a direct assault on the idea that the right software or the right functional role is enough for real understanding.
Okay, so walk us through the Chinese room.
Imagine there's a room, and inside is a man who speaks only English. Let's call him John. He doesn't know a single word of Chinese.
Okay.
Through a slot in the door, he gets past slips of paper with Chinese characters on them. These are questions, but to him they're just meaningless squiggles.
He has no idea what they mean.
None. But inside the room with him is a massive, incredibly detailed rule book written in English. This rule book is the program. It says, if you see this squiggle, go find that squiggle from this box and send it out.
So it's a giant lookup table. He matches the input symbols to the output symbols based on the rules without any understanding.
Exactly. And the rule book is so perfect that from the outside, the system looks completely fluent. A native Chinese speaker outside the room passes in a question, and a few moments later, a perfectly coherent, intelligent answer in Chinese comes out.
Functionally, the system, John plus the book, is indistinguishable from a native Chinese speaker. It passes the Turing test.
It does. But here's Searle's killer question. Does anyone or anything in that room actually understand Chinese?
Well, the rule book doesn't understand anything. It's just a book. And John definitely doesn't understand Chinese. He's just manipulating symbols.
Exactly. And Searle's point is this. If you can have a system that perfectly replicates the function of understanding, but has zero actual understanding or consciousness, then functionalism is false.
Yeah.
Having the right inputs and outputs is not enough to create a mind.
It seems to show there's a difference between simulating intelligence and actually being intelligent. It pushes us right back to that hard problem of internal subjective meaning.
It does. It suggests that consciousness requires something more than just clever symbol shuffling. And that, in turn, leads us to the most radical, and for some, the most chilling, version of physicalism.
Which is eliminativism.
Yes. The eliminativist looks at all these problems, the Chinese room, the trouble with qualia, and takes a dramatic step. They say maybe the problem isn't with our theories, maybe it's with our whole vocabulary for talking about the mind.
So concepts like belief, desire, hope, fear.
They argue that these terms are part of a primitive, pre-scientific theory of the mind, which they call folk psychology. And just like we threw out old scientific concepts like phlogiston for fire or the celestial spheres for astronomy.
You should just throw out belief and desire.
That's the prediction, that as neuroscience advances, we won't find the brain state that corresponds to your belief that it's raining. That concept is too crude. Instead, we will develop a new, much more precise scientific vocabulary that talks directly about neural activation patterns, neurotransmitter levels, and synaptic weights.
So in the future, we wouldn't say, I believe it's going to rain. We'd say something like, I don't know, my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is in state 7.4b.
Something like that. It's the prediction that our everyday understanding of our own minds is fundamentally wrong and will eventually be replaced entirely by a mature neuroscience.
That is an incredible thought, that the very way we think about ourselves is just a mistake.
It requires you to accept that your deepest feelings and intentions are, in a sense, just useful fictions that science will eventually move beyond.
So we've covered the two huge camps, dualism and physicalism. But it seems like no matter where you stand, every conversation eventually comes back to this one central nagging mystery that we've touched on.
The hard problem of consciousness.
Right. And it was actually a physicalist philosopher, David Chalmers, who really framed it this way.
Yes, he made a distinction between the easy problems and the hard problem. The easy problems are, well, not easy at all. They're incredibly difficult scientific challenges,
Right.
but they're a matter of function.
Like, how does the brain process sensory data? How do we retrieve memories? How do we focus attention? Science seems to be making progress on those.
Exactly. We can see a path forward. But the hard problem is a different kind of challenge altogether. It asks, why? Why does all of that physical information processing feel like anything at all from the inside?
Why isn't it all just happening in the dark? Why isn't the human body just a very sophisticated zombie that processes information and reacts to the world without any inner experience?
That's the explanatory gap. We can trace the path of light hitting your eye and signals going to your brain. But we cannot explain the leap from those physical signals to the private, internal, subjective experience of seeing the color red. There's nothing in the physics that says it has to feel like something.
So given this gap is so profound, what are the main responses from thinkers who take it seriously?
There are really two big paths. The first is to say the gap is real and may be permanent. This often pushes people towards something new, like a revised form of property dualism, or some of the more alternative views we're about to discuss. They think consciousness is just a fundamental ingredient of reality that our current physics is missing.
And the other path?
The other path, taken by many physicalists, is to argue that the gap is an illusion. It's a failure of our current concepts or our human intuition. They're betting that some future scientific revolution, maybe in quantum physics, maybe in information theory, will one day show us how consciousness necessarily arises from physical processes.
So they think in 200 years, the question will seem as silly as asking, but what is the life force in a living cell? We just don't have the right concepts yet.
That's the hope. But for now, that's all it is, a hope. And that intense difficulty has pushed some philosophers to think really, really outside the box.
Which brings us to the alternative views, starting with one that's been getting a lot of attention recently, panpsychism.
Panpsychism is fascinating because it tries to solve the hard problem by just dissolving it. The core idea is that consciousness, or at least some very primitive, basic form of it, maybe proto-experience, is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world.
So it's not something special that happens only in brains. It's everywhere. In rocks, in electrons.
At the most basic level, yes. The idea is that consciousness doesn't magically pop into existence when you arrange matter in a complex way. It was there all along as a basic property of matter itself.
So an electron might have an incredibly simple, rudimentary form of experience, and our rich, complex human consciousness is just what you get when you combine trillions of these tiny little points of experience in a very sophisticated structure, like a brain.
Exactly. So the problem is no longer how do you get experience from non-experience, which seems impossible. But the problem becomes how do you get complex experience from simple experience?
Which is still a really hard problem, the combination problem, but it feels, I don't know, more tractable.
It avoids that magical leap. It's a way of naturalizing consciousness by making it a fundamental part of nature.
Okay, what about the next alternative, neutral monism?
Neutral monism also wants to unify everything, but in a different way. It suggests that reality is, at its base, made of some kind of neutral stuff that is neither mental nor physical.
So mind and matter are not the fundamental things. There's something deeper.
Right. And this deeper neutral reality just appears to us in two different ways. When you look at it from the outside, with scientific instruments, it appears as matter, the physical brain.
And when you experience it from the inside through introspection, it appears as mind your consciousness.
But really, they're just two sides of the same coin. Two different perspectives on one underlying unified reality. It's an elegant way to give equal weight to both science and our own inner lives.
And finally, we have the complete flip of physicalism, idealism.
This is the most radical reversal. If physicalism says everything is matter, idealism says everything is ultimately mental.
So consciousness is the fundamental reality, and the physical world is what? An illusion.
Not necessarily an illusion, but something secondary. The idea is that what we call physical objects, this table, the moon, are really just patterns of experience or ideas within consciousness, maybe within a larger universal mind.
So instead of trying to cram mind into a material world, the idealist says the material world exists within a mental world.
Exactly. It's definitely not a mainstream view in science today, but it shows just how far you have to be willing to think to try and solve this puzzle.
This whole discussion is intellectually fascinating, but the sources are very clear that this isn't just a philosophical game. How you answer this question has profound consequences for everything, starting with free will.
This is a direct and unavoidable consequence. If you are a physicalist, you believe your brain is a physical system that follows the deterministic laws of nature.
Cause and effect. Every event is caused by the events that came before it.
Right. Which means every thought you have, every choice you make, is the inevitable outcome of prior physical causes. The state of your brain right now was determined by the state a second ago, and that was determined by the state before that, all the way back to the Big Bang.
So the feeling that I could have chosen tea instead of coffee this morning, that's just an illusion. The physics of the universe meant I was always going to choose coffee.
That's the position called hard determinism. It says free will is incompatible with a physicalist worldview. And since the physics is true, free will must be an illusion.
And for a dualist, free will is much easier to explain. They can just say the non-physical soul is outside the causal chain of physics and can genuinely initiate new actions.
Right. But most physicalists don't want to give up on free will, so they become compatibilists.
Meaning they think free will and determinism are compatible? How does that work?
They redefine freedom. They say freedom isn't about being an uncaused cause. Freedom is about acting according to your own internal desires and reasons without external coercion.
So even if my desire for coffee was physically determined, the action was free because I was the one who wanted it and nobody was forcing my hand.
Exactly. As long as the cause is internal to you, it's a free act. Your view on the mind-body problem really forces you into one of these camps. And that has huge implications for things like moral responsibility and the legal system.
And it gets even more personal when we talk about death and the afterlife.
The connection here is immediate. If you're a physicalist, the mind is what the brain does. When the brain stops doing anything, when it dies and decays,
Then the mind is gone. Consciousness ends. Mortality is final.
that's the straightforward conclusion. But if you're a substance dualist, and you believe you are a non-physical soul,
Then the death of the body is just like the pilot getting out of the plane. The soul can, in principle, continue to exist.
it makes survival after death logically possible. It's hard to overstate how much your answer here shapes your entire view of life, meaning, and your place in the cosmos.
Let's bring this down to a very practical area, mental health. How does this philosophical debate affect how we treat people?
Well, if you take a strict physicalist view, mental health issues like depression or schizophrenia are, at their root, problems with the physical brain. It's about brain chemistry, neural circuits, and genetics.
So the solution should be physical. Medication to correct the chemical imbalance, perhaps electroconvulsive therapy, things that directly target the hardware.
Right. It's a mechanistic approach.
Yeah.
The problem is in the machine, so you fix the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And that approach has had a lot of success.
But
if you take a view that acknowledges the reality of the mind, maybe as an emergent property, you see that the experience of suffering is not just a chemical imbalance. The subjective part is real and irreducible.
And you can't treat that subjective part with a pill alone.
Exactly. This validates approaches that deal with the software, so to speak. Talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, things that address a person's values, their sense of purpose, their narrative about their life.
So in reality, the best approach seems to be a combination of both.
I think so. Effective mental health care treats us as embodied beings who are also experiencers. It combines physical interventions with psychological and, well, philosophical ones.
And finally, we have to talk about artificial intelligence. This is where the debate is happening in real time.
This is the modern battleground. If functionalism is correct, if mind is just a pattern of information processing,
Then it's only a matter of time. As soon as we build a machine that's complex enough to replicate the functional patterns of a human brain,
then the functionalist has to admit that the machine is conscious. It has a mind. This is the philosophical belief that is driving so much of the research towards artificial general intelligence. They're building the function and betting that consciousness will come along for the ride.
But if you're a dualist, or if you think the Chinese room argument works,
Then the answer is completely different. If consciousness requires some special biological property of brains, or something non-physical, then no computer will ever be truly conscious, no matter how intelligent it seems.
it would just be a very, very sophisticated simulator, a philosophical zombie. It would say, it feels happy, but the lights would be off inside.
And our entire ethical stance towards these future creations depends on which philosophical view we take. Are we building tools, or are we building persons? That's what's at stake.
This has been an incredibly deep and, I think, really necessary exploration. Let's try to wrap up and synthesize the main perspectives we've covered.
Okay, first we had the dualist views. The idea that mind and body are distinct, either as two separate substances, which runs into the interaction problem, or as distinct, irreducible properties that emerge from the brain.
Then we have the dominant view in science, the physicalist views. Everything is physical. This can mean mind is identical to brain states, or it's about the functional software the brain is running, or it's the radical idea that our whole concept of mind should just be eliminated.
And finally, we saw that the sheer difficulty of the hard problem of consciousness has pushed people to these fascinating alternative views, like panpsychism, which says consciousness is everywhere, or neutral monism, which says mind and matter are just two sides of a deeper reality.
And the unavoidable conclusion from all of this is there is no consensus. Every single one of these options has serious problems.
Dualism struggles to explain how mind interacts with the physical world. Physicalism struggles to explain how the physical world can produce subjective experience.
So we're sort of left in this position where we have to take two things seriously at once. On one hand, the science is overwhelming. We are embodied beings. Our minds are tied to our brains in a deep and powerful way.
But at the same time, we have to honor our own direct evidence. We are experiencers. We have this inner life, this qualia, this subjective reality that no equation or brain scan seems to fully capture.
Maybe the problem is that our language forces us into this either choice. Either it's matter or it's mind.
It could be. Perhaps the ultimate reality is something that our concepts just can't neatly divide. Maybe it's not a duality or a singularity, but just an irreducible complexity.
And that question, whether that inner light is a separate soul, an emergent property of matter, or a fundamental feature of the cosmos itself, that continues to be the biggest challenge for both science and philosophy. But what we know for sure is this. The moment you choose an answer, you have defined your place in the universe.
It's true. If the mind is just matter, then your story is a physical one, bound by the laws of physics and ending with your body. But if the mind is something more, then the story gets a lot bigger. It suggests the most real part of you, your consciousness, might just be one chapter in a much longer book.
So as you go through the rest of your day, just notice it. Notice the thought, I should get up, and then watch your physical body move. And ask yourself, are the watcher and the machine the same thing? Or are you two different realities, somehow mysteriously bound together? That's the thought we'll leave you with today.